Elspeth Fenwick folded her hands over the pins in her lap and told herself she would not cry before the church bells started, and by the time her mother came into the small back bedroom carrying a tallow candle and something small wrapped in a handkerchief, she had very nearly kept the promise. The room smelled of beeswax and the lavender water her mother pressed into every drawer of the house, whether there was linen in it or not, and under that, faint, the mineral cold of a house that had not been able to afford enough coal for 3 winters running. Marian Fenwick set the candle on the washstand, and she did not sit, because sitting would have meant staying, and staying would have meant saying the thing twice. She unfolded the handkerchief, and there was her own mother's thimble inside it, pewter gone the colour of a rained-on sixpence, dented on one side in a small crescent where it had been dropped down a stair some 40 years before anyone in that room had been born. "Take this," she said, and closed Elspeth's fingers around it before her daughter could see her face clearly. "Keep it in your hand tomorrow night, not in a drawer, in your hand." Elspeth turned the thimble over once with her thumb, the dent fitting itself into the pad of her finger as though it had been waiting there. She asked why, though she already half knew the shape of the answer from a dozen overheard fragments at church doors and behind fans at the assembly rooms, the way county gossip moves without ever quite finishing a sentence. Because every Ashcombe bride gives something up on her wedding night, her mother said. That is the whole of the tradition, and no one has ever told me what. 3 duchesses in 3 generations, and not one of them the same woman after as before. Elspeth said that surely it was only an old story, the kind that grew fat on being repeated, and her mother's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "I hope so," she said. "I have hoped so since the banns were read. Now go and sleep if you can. Nan will wake you at 6. When the door closed, Elspeth sat a long while with the thimble warm in her palm, and did not sleep. Because sleep would have meant setting it down, and she had promised, and because underneath the promise was the plainer, colder fact of why this marriage existed at all. Her father had once been a clerk of some promise, articled young to the family who managed the Ashcombe estate, and something had gone wrong. In a year she had been too small to understand. A dismissal without explanation. A seizure that same winter that had left the left side of his face slower than the right, and his hand unable to hold a pen steadier than a drunk man's. And after that the slow, grinding, genteel poverty that ate a household one small sale at a time. The good silver first. Then the second horse, then, at the last, nearly the roof. A duke did not marry into that kind of ruin for love of a dowry, since there was none worth the word, and Elspeth was neither foolish nor vain enough to pretend she did not know it. She had met him twice, once at an assembly where he had said almost nothing and watched everything, and once at her father's own kitchen table. Of all unlikely places, where he had come about some small matter of an old lease, and had sat across from her while her father's ruined hand shook over the columns, and she had, without entirely meaning to, reached across and finished the sum herself, cleanly, aloud. Because it was easier than watching him fail at it in front of a stranger. The Duke of Ashcombe had looked at her then the way a man looks at a lock that has just unexpectedly turned. Down in the kitchen the next morning, Nan Pruitt was already awake. Because Nan was always awake, and had been putting bread in front of Elspeth since before Elspeth could reach the table unassisted. "You look like a woman who's been told a ghost story and made to sleep in the room after," Nan said, not unkindly, setting down the pot. Elspeth told her about the thimble, about the warning, and Nan's mouth thinned in the particular way it did when she had an opinion and intended to spend it slowly. "Your mother was warned the same, and her mother before her," Nan said. "And not one of them ever came home in the morning with a mark on her that a body could point to. Whatever an Ashcombe bride gives up, it isn't given up with a fist. That's not nothing, girl, but it isn't the thing your mother's afraid of either." "What is it, then?" Elspeth asked. Nan only shrugged, the shrug of a woman who has decided a question is not hers to answer, and pushed the bread closer. "Ask him," she said. "He struck me as a man who'd tell the truth if a body had the nerve to ask him plainly, which is a rarer thing in a duke than you'd think." Outside, a cart went past too early and too fast for a lane that quiet, and Elspeth heard her father's voice lift somewhere above stairs, confused, asking her mother twice what day it was, and her mother's voice going low and patient the way it always did now, and Elspeth sat very still with the thimble in her apron pocket, and understood, in the plain unfrightened way one understands weather, that whatever tomorrow asked of her, she had already spent every other kind of choosing she was ever going to get. The wedding itself she would remember afterward mostly in pieces, the way a person remembers a fever. The church too warm for the season and smelling of trodden grass and hot wax. Sir Peter Hale's face in the second pew, composed into the particular blankness of a man determined not to be seen minding, though everyone in the parish had known for 2 years that he minded a great deal, and had said as much to her father twice, gently, before her father's mind had gone too uncertain to hear it properly. The Duke's hand closing over hers at the rail, dry and warm, and steadier than any hand she had touched in 3 years. And behind them both, near the door, a narrow gentleman in good black, who signed the register with a hand so practised it barely paused between letters, and who bowed to her afterward with a courtesy so complete it left nothing to object to, and who introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Crane, of Ashcombe, entirely at her ladyship's service, in a voice pitched exactly to the note of a man who has said that sentence a great many times, and never once meant the last 4 words. Her father brought in a wheeled chair for the occasion, wept without seeming to know why, and gripped her sleeve as she passed him and said, with sudden and startling clarity, "Mind the second book," and then looked confused himself, as though the sentence had arrived from somewhere he no longer had access to, and her mother hushed him, and smiled the apologetic smile of a woman managing a husband's illness in public, and the moment passed the way a fish passes under ice, seen once, gone. Elspeth carried it with her all the same, the way she carried the thimble, without knowing yet what either was for. Ashcombe Hall came up out of the land the way a held breath comes out of a chest, slowly and then all at once, and Elspeth's first impression of it, from the carriage window with her new husband silent and watchful across from her, was not of grandeur but of scale, the sheer improbable size of a house built to be seen from 3 parishes away. The avenue ran a mile through beeches gone gold at the edges with the first real cold of the year, and the air through the half-open window carried wood smoke and wet stone, and underneath the mineral sweetness of a lake somewhere out of sight. He had said very little the whole journey, which she had at first taken for coldness and had begun, by the 2nd hour, to suspect was something nearer its opposite, a carefulness, a man rationing his own words the way her father used to ration coal. When she asked him, finally, whether the house had a name for itself among the people who worked it, the way houses sometimes did, he considered the question with a gravity that made her feel, absurdly, that she had asked something important. "They call it the old lady," he said. "My grandmother used to say a house that sighs needs a name a servant isn't afraid to say aloud at midnight." Elspeth said she thought that was the kindest thing she had heard anyone say about a pile of stone, and something moved at the corner of his mouth, a smile that arrived a half-breath before it reached his eyes and did not quite finish arriving even then, as though he had learned somewhere that a full smile cost more than he wished to spend in front of witnesses. They were met on the steps by a household drawn up in careful order, and at the near end of that order stood Mr. Crane, already there ahead of the carriage, though she could not have said by what road, and beside him a very old woman in black bombazine, who did not curtsy so much as consent, briefly, to bend, and who was introduced as Lady Frances Vane, the Duke's great-aunt keeper, Elspeth would learn, of the good silver and the family's long memory in equal parts. Lady Frances looked at Elspeth for a length of time that would have been rude in anyone with less evident right to be rude, and said, "At last, you're thinner than your mother," which is not a compliment, girl. It's an observation, and then turned and went into the house without waiting to see the effect of it. Crane, by contrast, was warmth itself, warmth applied with the same evenness a good tailor applies chalk, and he took Elspeth's hand and held it a fraction longer than the occasion required, and said he hoped her ladyship would come to think of him as she might an old family solicitor, which was, he said, very near what he was, having served 3 generations of Ashcombes, and hoping, God willing, to serve a 4th. Something in the phrase snagged at her, small as a thread catching on a nail, and was gone before she could name why, though that night, writing to her mother by candlelight, she found she had written the name Crane twice on the blotting paper, without meaning to, in a hand not quite her own, the hand she used when she was thinking of her father. The rooms she was given ran along the east front, sun in the morning, and from her window she could see, across the lawns and the black shine of the lake. A single lit window in the west wing that burned long after every other light in the house had gone out, and when she asked her new maid whose room that was, the girl said, without looking up from the fire she was laying, "That's Mr. Crane's study. My lady, he keeps late hours, he always has," and said it in the flat, unremarkable tone of a fact so ordinary nobody in the house had thought to wonder at it in years. The wedding breakfast, the next day, was the largest gathering of county families Elspeth had ever stood inside, and she stood inside it the way a person stands inside weather, enduring rather than attending. Sir Peter Hale found her near the orangery, correct in every particular, and wished her joy in a voice that cost him something to keep level, and she found she was glad of him there, glad of one face in the crush that had known her before any of this, when she had been simply Elspeth Fenwick with ink on her cuff, and a father who could still hold a pen. "I ought to have spoken sooner," he said, 2 years ago, before your father's illness, before any of it, and did not finish the sentence, because there was no way to finish it that would not have sounded like a complaint against a bride on her own wedding day, and he was too decent a man for that. She told him, gently, that speaking sooner would have changed nothing about her father's hand or the roof over her mother's head, and he accepted that the way he accepted most things, with a small dry nod and a joke, a moment later, about the excessive quantity of aspic on offer, because Peter Hale's particular gift, she had always thought, was knowing exactly how long a silence could be allowed to sit before it curdled. Across the lawn, Crane moved through the guests with the easy proprietary grace of a man who had arranged the placement of every chair, which, she would learn, he had. It was Lady Frances, cornering her by the lemon trees with the frank cruelty of the very old, who first spoke the thing aloud that Elspeth's mother had only wrapped in cloth and pressed into her hand. "You'll have heard by now some tale about the wedding night," Lady Frances said, not a question. Elspeth admitted she had. "Half the county tells it, and none of them agree on what's given up. Only that something is," Lady Frances said, "and here is what I know, for whatever an old woman's knowing is worth. Isabel, the last Duchess, the boy's mother, was never the same after hers. Not struck, not starved, nothing a magistrate could put a name to. Only smaller after, in a way a wedding is not supposed to make a woman." And when Elspeth asked carefully what had happened to her, Lady Frances's face did something Elspeth had not yet seen it do. A brief, unguarded flinch, quickly put away. "I don't know," she said. "I have wondered 30 years, and I don't know, and that not knowing is the ugliest thing in this house, worse than whatever the thing itself turns out to be." The Duke found her not long after, drawn by some instinct she would come to recognise in him, the instinct of a man checking a wound to see whether it has opened again, and he asked what his great-aunt had been saying, and Elspeth, who had already decided in the first day of her marriage that she would rather ask a hard question badly than not ask it at all, said plainly, "She told me your mother was never the same after her wedding night, and I should like to know why my mother thinks I ought to fear mine." Something crossed his face and was mastered, the particular stillness of a man closing a door quietly rather than slamming it. "There is a custom in this family," he said, "of signing the marriage settlement privately, in the study, on the wedding night, before witnesses countersign it in the morning. It has always been done that way. My father did it. His father did it." He stopped, and his right thumb moved. She noticed for the first time, though she would notice it many times again, a small quarter turn against the signet ring on his smallest finger. The gesture of a man winding something tight inside himself. "I don't know what happened to my mother that night," he said. "I was 19. I was not told, and by the time I was old enough to ask properly, there was no one left willing to answer. I only know that afterwards she asked fewer questions than she had before, and that within 2 years she was dead, and that I have never once, since, been entirely at peace with the word tradition." He did not take her to the study that night. She would understand later, much later, what it had cost him not to, how deep the groove of that habit ran, in a house that did nothing by accident. But at the time, she only knew that when Nan left her at the door of the ducal bedchamber, and the door closed, and the fire settled in the grate, with a sound like someone turning over in their sleep, the Duke of Ashcombe did not reach for any document at all. He stood by the window with his back half to her, the lit square of Crane's study visible across the dark lawn behind him, like a second, smaller moon, and he said, without turning, "I am told I ought to have papers waiting on that desk. My father's did, on his night. I have decided against it." Elspeth, who had spent the whole of the carriage ride home from the church rehearsing a dozen brave and defensive things to say if he asked anything of her, found she had nothing prepared for a man who asked for nothing at all, and stood with the thimble a hard small comfort in her closed fist, and said, "Then what do you want?" He turned then, and the fire caught his face at an angle that made him look younger than he had all day, and younger than the title made him seem, and he said, "I don't want anything from you tonight that you don't wish to give. I only want to know what you wish for. Not from me, in general. What a woman in your position, married for reasons that have very little to do with her, might actually want if someone troubled to ask." It was such a plain question, asked so plainly, that it undid her faster than any tenderness could have. She told him, in the end, about her father, about the second book he had said, gripping her sleeve at the church door, a sentence that meant nothing to her and that she had not been able to set down since, and about the thimble, and about her mother's fear, and he listened the way she had watched him listen at the kitchen table months before, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, only attending, and when she was finished he said, "I wish I could tell you my mother's story ended better than it did. I wish I understood it well enough to promise you yours will. I can promise you I will not put a paper in front of you and call it tradition and expect you to sign it in the dark. That is the whole of what I can promise tonight, and I know it is not much." She said it was more than she had been led to expect. And it was true, and he heard that it was true, and something in his shoulders came down 1/2 an inch. The way a man's shoulders come down when a weight he has carried so long he has forgotten its shape is, for one evening, set on a shelf instead. They talked past midnight, of ordinary things mostly, her father's ruined hand, his own dead mother's habit of keeping bees, the way the lake froze in patches before it froze whole. And once, gently, he made a joke so dry and so unexpected that she laughed aloud before she had decided to, and he looked startled by his own joke, as though he had not planned to make it, and was as surprised as she was that it had escaped him. There was a knock near 1 in the morning, apologetic, insistent, and Crane's voice through the door, low, regretting the intrusion. But the notary would need the settlement initialed before he left for London at first light. Only a formality, your grace, a moment of your time. The Duke's jaw set, and the ease of the last 2 hours folded itself away as visibly as a hand closing, and he said, through the door, that it would keep until morning. And Crane's voice said, "Of course, your grace, entirely as you wish," in a tone so smooth it left no mark at all, and retreated. Elspeth felt the room's temperature change without the fire having moved. "I ought to help you with it, in the morning," she said, before she had entirely decided to offer it. "I was raised on my father's ledgers. I can read a column of figures faster than most clerks, and I would rather understand what I am signing than be told it is only tradition." The Duke looked at her a long moment, and something that was almost relief and almost fear crossed his face together, and he said, "Then help me." And it was, though neither of them yet knew it, the exact bargain that would very nearly undo them both. Autumn thinned into a hard, bright winter, and Elspeth learned the shape of her new life the way one learns a house in the dark, by the shins bruised on furniture not yet accounted for. She learned that Lady Frances pressed flowers in the long gallery every Sunday afternoon, and considered the habit a discipline rather than a pastime, that Sir Peter Hale had taken chambers near enough to ride over twice a month on some pretext of estate law that fooled no one, that Crane managed everything, the rents, the timber accounts, the almshouse subscriptions, the correspondence with the family's bankers, with such total and uncomplaining competence that even the Duke, who trusted almost no one else in that house completely, trusted Crane the way a man trusts a bridge he has crossed 1,000 times without incident. It was in February, helping to reconcile a modest household account for the Ashcombe almshouses, a task the Duke had handed her half as a courtesy, and half, she suspected, because he had noticed how restless she grew with nothing to do that used her properly, that Elspeth found the first thread. 6 cottages were listed as receiving coal money that winter, and she had walked the row herself only that week with a basket for an old tenant's lying in. and had counted, without particularly meaning to count, only 5 chimneys smoking. She said nothing to anyone at first, assuming an error, a widow moved on, a cottage standing empty, the ordinary small untidiness of any large estate's books. But the number recurred the following month, and the month after always the same modest sum, always the 6th cottage, and always, she began to notice, in a column headed Almshouse Trust rather than the ordinary household account, a column she had not been shown before, and had come upon only because the ledger's spine had cracked and fallen open to it in her lap. She found Lady Frances in the long gallery on a grey Sunday, with a flower press open before her, and a look of deep, uncharacteristic gentleness on her face, laying a violet between 2 sheets of blotting paper, with the care of a woman handling something alive. A flower pressed too long between the pages does not die, child, the old woman said, without being asked, sensing perhaps that Elspeth had come with a question she did not yet know how to shape. It only waits to be found again, precisely as it was in the hour it was cut. She looked up. "You've found something." Elspeth told her haltingly about the 6th cottage, and Lady Frances's hands went still over the press. "Isabel kept her own accounts once," she said at last. "A little book, copied out on Sundays, for her own peace of mind," she used to say, though I always thought it was more than peace of mind by the end. It vanished when she died. I never knew where. If such a book existed once, it might exist again, in someone honest enough to want it. "Your father," she said, with sudden shrewdness, "was a clerk here once, wasn't he? Before my grandnephew's time." Elspeth said he had been, and that he had said something strange at the wedding, mind the 2nd book, and could not now be pressed further on it, his mind coming and going like weather. "Then go and sit with him on a clear day," Lady Frances said, "and ask him gently, and bring a pen, because a clear day does not always come twice." That night Elspeth told the Duke what she had found, sitting close to the fire in the small sitting room that had become, without either of them deciding it formally, theirs rather than his, and watched his thumb find the signet ring and turn it once, twice, the gesture she now recognised as the sound. In him, that dread makes when it has nowhere else to go. "It is likely nothing," he said, too quickly for a man who believed it. "Crane has managed this estate since before I could ride. If there were an error of that size he would have found it himself years ago and corrected it, out of nothing but pride in his own work." Elspeth said she hoped that was so, and did not entirely believe it either, and understood, watching him, that she had just found the one subject in the house he could not yet bear to examine plainly, the one door in a man otherwise so honest with her, that he had left every other room of himself standing open. Her father had a clear day on the 2nd Tuesday in March, one of those bright cold mornings when whatever the seizure had taken from him seemed briefly, mercifully to loosen its grip, and Elspeth sat with him in the small parlour of her parents' house, with a pen and a fresh sheet of paper, and did not press him, only let him talk. The way Nan had always said was the only way to get anything true out of anyone. He remembered, that morning, being a young clerk of 22, proud of his hand, proud of being trusted with the Ashcombe books, and he remembered a column that would not balance, a modest sum, repeating, always routed through a trust for the almshouses that seemed. When he walked the row himself one winter afternoon on an errand for old Mr. Crane, to be maintaining rather fewer almshouses than the books claimed. "I copied the page," he said, his ruined hand trembling on the arm of the chair, "before I understood what it would cost me to have copied it. I meant only to check my own arithmetic. I thought I had made some error, and I wanted a fair copy to work from at home, at night, quietly, so as not to trouble anyone with a young clerk's stupidity. And when I found no error in the arithmetic, only in the trust, I took it to old Mr. Crane's son, who was managing the day-to-day of it even then, and told him plainly, thinking he would thank me for it. He said Josiah smiled at me. He said I had a bright future, and that bright futures were built by young men who understood which questions were theirs to ask. I was dismissed within the month, for an unrelated fault, they called it, a discrepancy in my own petty cash that I have never to this day understood the origin of, and no house in the county would take a clerk dismissed from Ashcombe with a shadow like that on him. Elspeth asked, very gently, what had become of the copy, and her father's eyes for a moment focused on her with a clarity that frightened her more than his confusion ever had. In the writing slope, he said, the false bottom. I never told your mother. I told myself for 30 years it was pride keeping it there. Evidence of my own cleverness, my own ruin, kept like a scar you show no one. I think now it may have been the only honest thing I did in all those years, keeping it where it could still be found. She found the writing slope in the box room that afternoon, dusty, the leather cracked, and the false bottom gave under her thumbnail with the small dry sound of a thing releasing a held breath, and inside, folded small, brittle at the creases, was a single page in a young clerk's careful hand, dated 31 years before, showing, beside the official Ashcombe Almshouse Trust figures for that year, a second column, the true one and the gap between them, modest that first year, a few pounds only, the gap a man begins with before he learns how large a gap can grow, without anyone thinking to measure it. She rode back to Ashcombe, with the page against her chest under her cloak, like something stolen, though it was, in the truest sense, the very opposite of stolen, a thing finally coming home. She went to Crane herself before she went to her husband, not from any wish to spare the Duke, but because she had learned enough by then of the man's economy of manner to think she might get more truth from him cornered politely than from any confrontation staged with witnesses, and she found him in his study with the lamp already lit, though it was not yet 4 o'clock. The room smelling of beeswax and old paper, and faintly, of the cigars he did not smoke in front of the family. He rose when she entered, unhurried, and drew out a chair for her, with the same unbroken courtesy he had shown her on the church steps, and she thought, watching him do it, that his courtesy fit him like a coat cut for another man, close enough to pass at a distance, and no closer. She laid the page on the desk between them without preamble. He looked at it a long moment, and something in his face did adjust, briefly, a recalculation rather than a shock. The look of a man who has always known a particular bill might one day come due, and is only now checking the date on it. "You have your father's hand for figures," he said at last, which was, I always thought, wasted on him in the end. He was a careful clerk. Careless in one respect only, which is that carefulness, in a young man with no protector, is sometimes indistinguishable from insolence to the people who employ him. Elspeth said she had not come to discuss what had been done to her father 30 years ago, only what was being done now, and Crane folded his hands and regarded her with what looked disconcertingly like genuine respect. "Then let me be plain with you, since you have clearly earned plainness," he said. "This estate carries 4,000 acres, 11 tenant farms, 200 souls who eat because the rents are collected steadily, and the accounts, whatever their small irregularities, inspire confidence in the bankers who extend this family credit against a bad harvest. I have managed that confidence for 31 years. A young bride, however clever with a column of figures, marching into a county assembly with an accusation against the family's own solicitor, would not restore a single pound to a single almshouse. It would only tell every creditor in 3 counties that Ashcombe's books cannot be trusted, and it is tenant families, not dukes, who starve first when credit dries up. I am not cruel, Lady Ashcombe. I am arithmetical, which the young always mistake for cruelty. She told him, evenly, that she had not come to march anywhere, only to ask him plainly whether the figures balanced, and he said, with the first flicker of something that was not quite composure, that figures always balanced eventually in someone's favour, and the only question worth asking of any ledger was whose. She left him with the lamp still burning behind her, and understood, walking back across the dark lawn, that she had just been warned, courteously, thoroughly, by a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much warning a person could absorb before they either broke or obeyed, and that she intended to do neither. The catastrophe, when it came, arrived by the worst possible door at the worst possible hour, which was, she would later think, precisely how catastrophe always arrived in that house, dressed as a small ordinary inconvenience until it was standing fully formed in the middle of the room. Sir Peter had ridden over on the pretext of estate law, as he did, and Elspeth had asked him, as a barrister rather than as anything more complicated, to look over her father's page and the current almshouse accounts side by side, to tell her plainly whether what she suspected could be proven in any court a magistrate would recognise, and he had spread both pages on the small writing desk in her sitting-room with the careful, absorbed gravity he brought to any true problem, and had just said, "This is not an error, Elspeth. This is 30 years of a man building himself a second income out of other people's charity," when the door opened without a knock, because it was, after all, his own house, and the Duke stood in it. What he saw, in the half-second before either of them could speak, was his wife and the man the whole county had once expected her to marry. Heads bent together over papers spread across a private desk, low voices, a closeness that owed nothing, in fact, to anything but arithmetic and old friendship, but that told from the doorway an entirely different and much older story. The story of a man who had once watched his own mother whispered about by people who claimed to be protecting him from an unpleasant truth. Crane was 2 steps behind him in the corridor, and it was Crane's voice, pitched low and full of manufactured reluctance, that reached the room first. "I did try to spare your Grace this," he said. "I had hoped it was nothing. Sir Peter has been a frequent visitor these past months, and her ladyship has shown a great deal of interest lately, in matters that touch a good deal of money passing quietly between hands. I make no accusation. I only observe what any man might observe." The Duke did not raise his voice, which was, Elspeth would understand later, so much worse than if he had. He only asked Sir Peter with terrible courtesy to leave them, and Sir Peter, seeing the shape of the thing forming in the room, tried to speak. And the Duke said, quietly, "I think you have said enough for one afternoon, Hale, and Peter, decent to the last, gathered the papers himself so they would not be left for anyone else to seize, and went. And the door closed, and Elspeth stood alone with a husband who was looking at her the way a man looks at a bridge he has just watched give way under someone else's weight, still standing, not yet trusted. She began to explain, about her father, about the 6th cottage, about the false bottom of an old writing slope, and he heard perhaps a third of it before Crane, still in the doorway, said, "Gently, your Grace. Perhaps it would be kinder to all concerned to let the matter rest tonight, and the Duke, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, said yes, and looked at Elspeth with an expression she had not seen on him before, and would spend a long night trying to name, and left the room without another word, and the lamp in Crane's study, she noticed later, from her own dark window, burned very late indeed. He did not come to her that night, nor the next, and on the third day he told her, in the flat, correct voice of a man reciting something he had rehearsed alone, that he thought it best she go to her father's house for a while, to give them both room to think clearly, and offered it sincerely as a kindness, a shelter from a household suddenly full of eyes, and she heard it as banishment, because banishment was the only shape her mother's old warning had ever given her to recognise, and she went. Crane, in the days that followed, was a portrait of sorrowful discretion, and it was he, not the Duke, who came to her in the small parlour of her parents' house on the fourth evening with an offer wrapped in the softest possible cloth. A settlement. Generous, quietly arranged, papers already drawn, her family's debts cleared entirely, and a comfortable annuity besides, in exchange for nothing more than her signature and her silence, and a return, with whatever dignity could be salvaged, to a quiet establishment somewhere the county would not think to look too closely. It would spare everyone, he said, a great deal of unpleasantness. Your father's name need never come into it at all. She held the pen he offered her a long moment, and thought of her mother's thimble upstairs in her old room, and of a man asking her, on the one night she had been braced for cruelty, what she wished for, and she set the pen down. No, she said, and let the word stand alone before she explained it. The way Nan had always told her the truest refusals were the shortest ones. I did not marry to be spared the truth, she said. I married a man who once asked me what I wished for, instead of telling me what I owed. I wish for that still. I will not sign my father's silence a second time to buy my own comfort, and I will not be paid to disappear from a house where I have done nothing but arithmetic. Crane's composure did not crack, quite, but something in it thinned, the way ice thins before it goes, and he gathered the untouched papers with hands that were, for the first time since she had known him, not entirely steady, and told her, with a courtesy grown suddenly brittle, that she would come to regret refusing kindness when it was offered, and left her sitting alone in her mother's parlour with the fire burned low, and the county outside going quiet under the first hard frost of the year, and no clear notion at all of what came next. It was Lady Frances who came to her father's house 4 days later, in a hired carriage she plainly considered beneath her, and sat in the parlour without removing her gloves and said, "Without preamble, I have spent 30 years wondering what happened to Isobel, and calling my own cowardice patience, and I find I am too old to go on making that mistake. There is to be a meeting of the trustees and the family solicitor at Ashcombe on Thursday, to review the quarter's accounts, as there always is, and Crane does not yet know that I have asked Sir Peter Hale to attend as counsel, nor that I have asked my grandnephew, who is a great fool about his own heart, and no fool at all about anything else, to open the books before the whole room rather than after." She looked at Elspeth over the rim of her spectacles. "A flower pressed too long only waits to be found. Child, I think Thursday is the day it is found. Bring your father's page." Thursday came in cold and very clear, the frost still on the lawns at noon, and the long dining-room at Ashcombe filled, by 2 o'clock, with more solemn faces than Elspeth had seen gathered since her own wedding breakfast, trustees and the family's banker, and the county's senior magistrate, invited, Lady Frances admitted afterward, on the thinnest of pretexts, and Sir Peter Hale, seated with a barrister's composed neutrality at the foot of the table, and the Duke himself at its head, pale, correct, not yet looking at his wife directly, though she felt his awareness of her the way one feels a draught from a door not quite shut. Crane opened the quarter's books himself, as he always did, smooth, unhurried, reciting figures from memory the way another man might recite a well-loved poem. And it was the Duke, at a nod from his great-aunt that Elspeth alone seemed to catch, who said, quite plainly, before Crane had finished, that he understood there was a second page that ought to be read alongside the first. Elspeth laid her father's copy on the table, and Sir Peter, rising, read it aloud, every figure, every date, in the flat, clear voice of a man reading evidence into a record, so that everyone in that room heard the same words in the same order at the same moment. And the difference between the two columns sat on the polished wood between them like something you could have picked up and weighed in your hand. Crane, for one unguarded instant, reached across the table toward the page, not to explain it, but to take it, a small involuntary lunge quickly checked, and it was that single movement, more than any figure Sir Peter read aloud, that turned every face in the room against him, because a man with nothing to hide does not reach to seize the evidence. He recovered himself, and spoke of long service, of complicated years, of a young clerk once dismissed for insubordination he now allowed, in a voice gone suddenly older, might have been dismissed instead for honesty, and for a moment, just one. Something almost human moved across his face, a tiredness 30 years deep, before it settled again into the old smooth courtesy. It began small, he said, quietly, to no one in particular. A debt of my own father's. I told myself I would repay it and stop. I did not stop. The magistrate did not clap him in irons at the table, and the Duke, watching him, chose mercy tempered with justice rather than public ruin, a quiet resignation, restitution arranged over years rather than a scandal that would have cost the tenants as dearly as it cost Crane, and the old solicitor rose, at the last, and bowed to the room with something of his old composure restored, and said, to the Duke, "You have your mother's eye for a lie. Your Grace, she had it too." In the end, and left Ashcombe on foot, by his own choosing, the gravel loud under his shoes in the sudden silence, and did not look back at the house even once. The room emptied slowly, the way rooms do after weather has broken in them, and it was full dark before the Duke found Elspeth alone in the long gallery, where Lady Frances kept her flower press, standing at the window that looked toward the west wing, where, for the first time in longer than anyone could say, no lamp burned late. "I am sorry," he said, before she could speak, "for the door, for the 4 days, for believing, even for an hour, a story that fit an old fear better than it fit you. My mother taught me without meaning to that the person telling you the calm story is not always the honest one. I forgot to ask which one you were." Elspeth told him he had asked her exactly the right question on the one night it mattered most, and had simply been too frightened, on this occasion, to wait for the answer, and he took that correction the way he took most true things from her, without flinching, and said, "Then ask me again, whatever you think I owe you. Name it, and I will not turn my back on it this time." She told him her conditions plainly, the way her father had once taught her to state a sum, without softening any figure to make it easier to hear. That her father's name be cleared before the county, publicly, in whatever form the law allowed, so that the last 30 years might finally be told correctly. That she keep a hand, her own hand, in the estate's true accounts from that day forward, not as a courtesy extended to a duchess, but as a right earned by a woman who had found what a professional agent had missed for 3 decades. That there be no more studies with lamps burning past midnight, no more doors closed on her with a kindness that was, in truth, only fear wearing a gentler coat. He agreed to every one of them before she had finished speaking the last, and then, quietly, in the emptying gallery with the last of the frostlight going blue on the lawns outside, he said the 4 words he had first said to her on a wedding night neither of them had known, then how to trust. "What do you wish for?" She told him, and it was, for once, an easy answer, and he gave it to her there in the gallery, with no witness but Lady Frances's pressed violets under glass. And it cost neither of them anything at all. A year turned over, the frost giving way to a wet green spring, and then to a summer so mild the beeches along the avenue never once scorched at the edges, and by the following autumn Josiah Fenwick's name had been read into the county record as the clerk who first found the discrepancy in the Ashcombe accounts 31 years before. An honest man wronged, the entry said, by the very trust he had tried to protect, and he lived to hear it read to him on a clear day, and wept again, this time knowing exactly why. On a cold, bright evening the following winter, in the same small back bedroom where it had all begun, Elspeth stood in the doorway and watched a young bride she had grown fond of, her husband's cousin's daughter, sit very straight on the edge of the bed, with her hands folded over pins she had forgotten to remove, trying not to cry before the church bells the next morning. Elspeth crossed the room and sat, and took the girl's cold hand, and pressed into it a thimble worn thin in one small spot the size of a grain of barley, and the girl asked, in a voice not unlike her own once had been, whether it was true that the Ashcombe women gave something up on their wedding night. "They will tell you that," Elspeth said. "They have told every bride in this house that for longer than anyone now living can account for. It is not quite a lie, and it is not quite the truth either. The house does not ask anything of you. Only a man might, if you let him close enough to ask honestly. And if he does," she said, closing the girl's fingers around the thimble the way her own mother once had, "ask him first what he wishes for. You may find the whole of the fear was only ever a warning about the wrong thing." Down in the hall she heard her husband's step, and further off, faint through the old stone, a child's laugh that was, unmistakably, their own daughter's, and the Duke of Ashcombe came to the door of the small room and looked at his wife across a bride's bent head, and did not need to ask what she wished for that particular evening, because after 4 years he had finally learned to simply give it to her before she thought to ask. "If this house sat with you a while tonight, the way it once sat with Elspeth, warming something that had gone cold, stay by the fire a moment longer before you go. I think of that thimble often, worn thin by hands that were never once as frightened as they'd been told to be, and of a duke who asked instead of demanded, and I'd love to know in the comments which line stayed with you longest, the mother's warning or the question that finally answered it. If a story like this one is the company you keep on a quiet evening, consider staying close to Catastrophe channel _name EUH, where the kettle is always found again on the hob, and another tale is already waiting to be lit. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whatever old fear you're still carrying. It may only be waiting, like a pressed flower, to be looked at again.